If you've ever had to juggle dozens of different SQL logins for all your Azure databases, you know what a headache it can be. Honestly, it can turn into a security nightmare and fast. So today, we're going to fix that. We are going to walk through step by step how to use Microsoft Entra, yep, that's the new name for Azure Active Directory, to centralize all your access, make management way simpler, and seriously lock down your data. So let me ask you this, and it really gets to the core of the problem. When you're dealing with a ton of databases, how are you actually managing user access? Are you still stuck creating individual SQL logins by hand for every single person on every single server? Because that's not just a ton of work, it's a massive security hole that just gets bigger every time you add a new database or a new person to the team.
And this slide really nails the difference. The old way, well, it's basically controlled chaos, right? You're juggling all these separate SQL logins, you're constantly dealing with password resets, and you have absolutely no central viewpoint or control. The modern way, using Entra, just completely flips that script. Now you've got one central place for identity, which means single sign-on for your users, unified governance for you, and way better security across the board.
So, how do we get there? Here's the game plan. We'll kick things off with the prerequisites, what you need to have in place. Then we'll walk through setting the main Entra admin. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of permissions, which is super important. Then we'll create the actual database users, and finally, we'll put a bow on it by securing the connection so your team can get to work safely.
All right, first things first, we've got to lay the groundwork. Before we click a single button in the Azure portal, we need to make sure all our ducks are in a row.
And it really just boils down to two main things. First, you obviously need a Microsoft Entra tenant already set up with your users and your security groups. And second, you need an Azure SQL resource ready to go, whether that's a SQL database, a managed instance, or even Synapse. And here's a key point. It doesn't matter if your identities are purely cloud-based or if you're syncing them from your on-prem Active Directory. Either way works perfectly.
Okay, on to our first major configuration step. To switch on Entra Authentication, you have to tell your SQL resource who's in charge. You do that by assigning a Microsoft Entra administrator. You can think of this person or group as the linchpin, the one critical connection between your SQL server and your entire identity system in Entra.
Now, the easiest way to do this is just right there in the Azure portal. You just navigate over to your SQL server, look for Microsoft Entra ID in the settings, click Set Admin, find the user or group you want to give this power to, and then you just hit Save. It's really that straightforward.
Bay, for all of you who live and breathe in the command line, don't worry, you are totally covered. You can automate this whole thing using PowerShell, the Azure CLI, or you can even hit the REST API directly. This is awesome for building security right into your infrastructure as code deployments.
And here is a pro tip that will save you a world of pain. Listen up. When you set that Entra admin, what happens behind the scenes is Azure creates a user for them in the server's master database. And since database usernames have to be unique, the display name of your admin cannot already exist in there. If it does, boom, the setup will fail. So watch out for that.
Okay, admin is set. Fantastic. Now we've got to talk permissions. And this part is absolutely critical, because your SQL resource needs permission to talk to Entra ID, to do things like check if a user is part of a certain group. How it gets that permission? Well, that actually depends on which SQL resource you're using.
And this is where we have a fork in the road. For Azure SQL Database and for Synapse, you get to use the principle of least privilege, which is great. You assign very specific granular permissions like user.read.all directly to the server's own identity. But for SQL Managed Instance, it's a different model. You have to assign the much broader directory reader's role to the instance's identity. Luckily, the portal gives you a nice little banner to help you get that done easily.
So here's the bottom line for anyone working with SQL Managed Instance. Somebody on your team, maybe you, has to have the privileged role administrator role in Entra ID. If you don't have that high-level permission, you physically cannot grant the directory reader's role, and you'll be completely stuck.
All right, the server-level stuff is done. Now we can zoom into the database itself and actually start giving people access by creating user accounts so they can connect and start querying data.
The way this works is by creating something called a contained database user. And the name says it all. The user exists only inside that one specific database. It's not a separate login living on the server. It's a user that's directly mapped and linked to an identity back in Microsoft Entra. And the T-SQL for this is just beautiful in its simplicity. You just connect to your database using an Entra account that has the alter any user permission, and you run this one command.
create user, the name of the user or group, and then the magic words, from external provider. That's it.
But hold on, here's another one of those little gotchas you need to look out for. Microsoft Entra doesn't care if two different users have the exact same display name, but SQL Server, oh, it cares. It requires every single user, every principal, to have a unique name. And that mismatch can make your create user command fail if you run into a name collision.
So what's the fix? Well, Microsoft gave us a great one, the with object ID clause. This lets you be super specific. You provide the unique object ID from Entra right when you create the user. It completely gets around any confusion from duplicate display names. I'm telling you, in a big company, this feature is an absolute lifesaver.
We are on the home stretch now. The users are all set up. So let's talk about adding that final layer of security polish and what it actually looks like for a user when they go to connect. Probably the single biggest security win you get from using Entra is how easy it is to enforce multi-factor authentication, or MFA. You know what this is. It's that process that asks for a second piece of proof, like a code from your phone app before it lets you in. It's not just an improvement, it's a massive security upgrade compared to just a password.
And here's the best part. You don't even configure this in SQL Server. Instead, you manage it all centrally by setting up a conditional access policy right inside Microsoft Entra. You can create a rule that basically says, hey, for anyone trying to get to this Azure SQL database, you must use MFA. It's so powerful.
And just one last little troubleshooting tip to put in your back pocket. If you've done everything we've talked about, but your users are still getting a connection timeout expired error, it's almost always one of two things. First, go back and double-check those graph permissions we talked about earlier. If they look good, then you might need to tweak a parameter in the connection string called transparent network IP resolution.
Okay, so let's do a super quick recap of the whole process. Step 1, you set your Entra admin. Step 2, you assign the right graph permissions depending on your SQL resource. Step 3, you create your contained database users that are mapped back to Entra. Step 4, you lock it all down with an MFA policy. And then finally, Step 5, your users can connect securely using the same work account they use for everything else.
And that really brings us to the end. We've successfully taken that mess of scattered individual logins and replaced it with a secure, centralized, and modern system. So the real question I want to leave you with is this. Now that you've got your authentication under control, what are you going to automate next? Maybe automated role assignments or access reviews? The door is now wide open. Thanks for tuning in.